Now it is my utter pleasure to introduce Greta Defeyter more appropriately and more thoroughly. So Greta is Professor of Developmental Psychology. She's also the Dean of Social Mobility and Policy Engagement, as well as being the Director of the Healthy Living Lab at Northumbria University. Greta has published numerous scientific and policy papers on children and young people's well-being, food insecurity, school breakfast clubs, affordable food clubs, the holiday activity and food program, and school meals, as well as other topics. She's led numerous projects which have really focused on co-designing outcomes with families and with schools to help really inform UK government policy and other policy decisions. This approach really does ensure that young people's voices are not only heard but acted upon in terms of policy and practice. And Greta, that is a leading example of what many of us hope to do in our work. Greta also became the president-elect for the Royal Society of Medicine Food and Health Section, and she was named Officer of the Order of the British Empire and given an OBE in recognition of her services to education. So Greta, over to you. We can't wait to hear much more about what you have to say about the school breakfast programme in England. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. Oh my goodness, I'm going to have to live up to that introduction now, so I'll try my utmost. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to canter through some slides today, but I will be sharing them with Christina and her team for everybody to have a copy of the slides as well as this webinar. So let me begin. So school breakfast clubs, as Christina said, this is a really hot topic, especially in the UK, but it's also quite a hot topic internationally and across the world as well. So let me just summarize some of the evidence based on scientific reports, as well as some practice-based reports and grey literature. And I think this is important because I keep seeing studies being touted by UK government in particular that don't really hold true in the evidence. And I'm going to suggest today that perhaps we are indeed asking the wrong questions. So in terms of breakfast clubs, so school breakfast clubs in particular, but I also include community breakfast clubs. So they are where a school has a link with a community centre that may hold a breakfast club prior to the start of the school day. And that can be beneficial for schools where there's space capacity, limitation on space. So we know that breakfast clubs help to ensure nutritional adequacy in school-age children. So for those children that may not have breakfast at home, or may have an unhealthy breakfast at home, a breakfast that's not nutritious in terms of its content, breakfast clubs help with that. There's also associated with better nutritional dietary profiles compared to children who habitually skip breakfast. There's decreased levels of snack food consumption across the school day and decreased likelihood of being overweight or obese. And that evidence is pretty strong. However, when we look at evidence regarding improved educational attainment, a rapid systematic review by the Education Endowment Fund in 2023 actually concluded that there was very little evidence of educational attainment. And that's quite different to what the what the Department of Education is saying about this 2 months improvement. So yes, that study by the Education Endowment, the same organisation, and Magic Breakfast did find 2 months improvement. But at the moment, that's not really typical of what's seen in the general literature. So it's just important to bear in mind. However, there are a number of studies that show a good level of positive effect regarding the effects of breakfast on cognition, and particularly memory and sustained attention. And of course, those cognitive processes lead to better educational outcomes. There's some positive effects regarding improved punctuality, very small effects for attendance, and there's really not enough evidence regarding the efficacy of different breakfast club models. So the grab and go model, having breakfast in the classroom, having breakfast in the dining hall, we just don't have the evidence. However, what I'm going to suggest today is that actually perhaps we're asking the wrong questions here. So when we look at breakfast clubs are one lever in the school system to help improve educational attainment, dietary intake, and actually also children's health and well-being. And my goodness, during COVID, didn't we realize how important that was, and the important roles that school played in making sure that our pupils had good mental and physical health and well-being. So I'm going to base it on these two papers. They're quite old papers. They're about 10 years old. But I'm just going to highlight the point that I think where we should really be looking in terms of breakfast clubs. So if I think about the first study, this study was done by a former PhD student of mine, Pamela Graham, who is now actually a lecturer at the Northumbria University. And what she did is she looked at early friendship equality scales. So this is a validated scale that measures friendship. And she compared 3 groups across 2 time periods. So we had a breakfast club group, an after school club, and a control group. And the time lag was 6 months apart. And what you can see here is actually, in terms of attending the breakfast club, it improves companionship, it reduces conflict, it actually helps in terms of children being willing to seek for help, so asking for help from staff, having a sense of security, and also a closeness both to staff and other pupils. Hopefully this sounds familiar post-COVID of things that we should be looking at. In the second part, she actually looked at peer victimization, and what you can see is breakfast clubs reduce physical victimization, social victimization, verbal victimization, but there's no change in property, and property refers to actually vandalizing a book or a physical item of some child. So I think this is really good evidence of the role that Breakfast Club played in terms of friendship and reducing antisocial behaviour. And I think it's an important study that's been overlooked for too many years, in my opinion. I'm now going to switch to a study conducted by another PhD student of mine. This was the only study in England that has looked at universal free breakfast provision across a whole local authority. So it really has resonance in terms of what the Department for Education is looking for in terms of its national breakfast club rollout in England. And what you can see here is that she developed, Louise Harvey Golding developed a universal free school breakfast club model. So this was a qualitative model that looked at various aspects from the local authority, or now Academy Trust, and schools, and looking at the benefits around each of these different parts of the implementation. So if you look on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see looking at implementation. In this particular evaluation, it was a Blackpool town. So we actually put this in Blackpool local authority. One of the things that came up was rushed implementation of the breakfast club framework. So I'm actually delighted that the Department for Education is actually conducting a pilot of 750 schools before it actually sends its rolls out the full implementation of the national scheme. There was definitely a lack of consultation with schools and parents, and I think that this is something that's really important for the Department for Education to not only look at schools but consider parents' views as well. And things, logistical problems around food delivery, waste storage, etc. Funding is always an issue, although I think that the funding level now offered by Department for Education is pretty good. And then looking at benefits to local authorities and schools on the right-hand side, raising the profile of the local authority, demonstrating innovation, help addressing food insecurity, improvement in health and reduction in inequalities, punctuality and attendance, alleviating child hunger, and actually also making sure that there is inclusion in terms of specialised schools, alternative provision and SEND settings. And the perceived impacts on children and parents, you can see for children, it alleviates hunger, positive start to the day. What was quite interesting here on the left-hand side, it said the potential to improve educational and behavioural outcomes. My goodness, they were right on the money there. I think there is potential. I just don't think we have strong enough evidence yet for that. And then looking at the benefits to parents and families, and it was alleviating rush morning routines, and actually looking at those additional childcare needs. And on the right-hand side, obviously alleviating food insecurity. And I think it's fair to say that breakfast clubs for some years have always been used as a form of childcare provision for parents to get to work. I actually don't see anything wrong with that. I think that as long as it's integrated into the wraparound childcare provision that is funded by the government and not double counted, I think that this is a good idea. It's a fact of modern life. So with that background in terms of the academic research and some of the grey literature, when the government announced a new national framework, we decided to run some co-design workshops, bringing together various stakeholders to think about and consider what the problems could be and what the facilitators would be to actually co-designing a new framework. So we're not looking here to criticize government, rather we're looking at bringing together the evidence from different stakeholders and actually coming up with innovative solutions. When we looked at co-designing, we partnered with obviously one of the leaders in the UK, Magic Breakfast, and Lindsay MacDonald helped organise this particular workshop. And in this first workshop, we had caterers, NGOs, charities, Cabinet Office, Department for Education, and academics all in the room together, all coming up with various questions and solutions and kind of barriers and facilitators. So there's no research question for this rather than the general aim and objective. That's important to note because this is a co-design piece of work. And we use various double diamond tools and various design tools to actually facilitate this process, including a wonderful illustrator called Ben Nightingale, who you can see sitting in the far left of the background there. So activity one was simply actually almost like an icebreaker, but thinking about where various people and organizations sat in the what I call the school food landscape or system. And I think that's really important because the funding coming down from the Department for Education is always siloed in the sense that it's funding for breakfast, funding for fruit and veg scheme through a different department, but funding for school meals, and then you've got the wrap care. And really, to me, that seems strange because the funding is going to the school and it's the child. And if we think of the child-centered approach for the child engaging in this food system, that same child will probably be involved in the breakfast club, maybe in the fruit and veg scheme if they're eating their fruit and veg in their break, in the school lunch, whether they're paying or they're free, and probably also in wraparound care. So if we switched it from a siloed funding approach to a child-centered approach, understanding where people sit in this landscape becomes much more important and thinking of efficiencies within the system. So moving on from the icebreaker, activity two was simply that we asked all of the participants to generate 3 to 5 core challenges. So things that they saw that could be potentially challenging. And let me give you an example. So one of the examples that came up was how do schools provide inclusive provision for SEND children when the transport for SEND often doesn't get them there in time for an 8:30 start at a breakfast club or before. And with that challenge, then they had to think of various creative propositions. So what if we changed the time of the transport, for example, for SEND children? How might we alleviate that? How could we do this? So it's very much practical steps of what about, could we do this? So really innovative thinking out of the box of coming up with practical but also effective solutions to some of the challenges that were identified. In activity 3, we used some prior research that we've just completed, looking at the rollout of the pilot scheme. So here are some of the scenarios that came from the focus groups that we conducted with teachers and other parents and key staff. So if you see there on the left, it says, I am a head teacher of a rural primary school with a small number of pupils. We currently get fundings from Greggs. Will I be able to get funding from Greggs and the DFE? This was asked numerous occasions, whether it be Greggs or Kellogg's, people were asking this a number of occasions. And I won't go through all of them there, but you can see that these were things that were coming out, thematic analysis of our focus groups that were kind of like main concerns. And on the bottom right there, you can see, I am a young mum who works shifts in a local factory. My school currently asks me to register my child for breakfast club on a termly basis, but this is difficult as I work shifts. How will I register for the new program that's free to all primary school children? So the point of having these scenarios is that we ask participants to relate these scenarios in terms of the different stakeholders and service users to the prior activity. So when thinking about the SEN provision, so, is this a limitation? Is this a barrier? How does this relate back to that activity? So would that have what would the effect be on teaching staff? So if SEN provision and transports came in earlier, then what would that change in terms of staff timetabling, and how could that be accommodated? And the same here. In our final part of this workshop, we actually worked with the illustrator to capture the content. So this is an opportunity here to ensure that all of the content is captured in the illustration and that everybody agrees with said content. And here is the final illustration. So this is almost like a theory of change model, but in an illustrated form, of thinking of the umbrella term of the funding, getting the funding right, looking at co-designing with all of the stakeholders at both the national, the local authority and the school level, and thinking about how this intersects and how all of these things relate to one another. And I think it's important to point out here, when you see it in terms of the bottom left and outcomes, the feeling of belonging, schools feeling supported and empowered, a soft start, pupils are nourished, increased physical activity, free morning childcare, improved relationships, improved mental health and well-being. These are the key things that I think that I see consistently in the literature, and also in people's perceptions about schools and how important school breakfast clubs are in supporting that wider school agenda for our pupils. We then moved on to look at using similar but different creative methods to capture the voices of children, parents and school staff. And anybody that's tried to do co-design with children will be fully aware that sometimes children's drawings are quite difficult to decipher. And so we've come up with some new ways of working, because one of the things that in my research is that we tend to choose children to participate when they've got good cognitive abilities, where they have good motor coordination skills, where they can draw really well. And what we wanted to do in this piece of work is actually capture children as young as the age of 5, because 5, 6 and 7-year-olds predominantly attend breakfast clubs. So we didn't want to exclude those children just because of a lack of language skills or a lack of being able to draw or write. So I'll explain exactly how we went about doing this. And this is the team that came and helped me. And in the front are some of the parents and the school cook who does the cooking for the breakfast club at this particular school that's based up in the Northeast. So this is a relatively new creative technique that we're using to capture the voices of children. It's a really engaging activity for children, and children as young as the age of 5 can do this. And it's simply drawing around, a child draws around their left hand and their right hand. And you can see that one on the bottom is really good, but the one on the top, you can see which is their dominant hand. And that's actually part of it, to say that actually it may not be perfect. It doesn't matter it being perfect. And what we do on this is that we ask them to use one hand on the bottom left. You can see their left hand is their happy hand and their right hand is things that they don't like. And we simply get them to either write, as in this example, or draw things that they like and things that they don't like about the breakfast club. And you can see that the detail that we get is actually quite good. The children that did this were age 5 on the top and 6 on the bottom. And what we can do from this is we can use collective hands together to conduct thematic or content analysis of what's actually on the hands. And you can see, if you look at the top and the bottom one, the juice is a common occurrence. None of the children at this breakfast club liked the juice that was served. And the staff that were delivering this breakfast club didn't realize that, and that's now been changed for everyone. That's really good. Now, this one is another creative method that we've used. And we get around the problem of children not being able to draw very well by actually using pre-cuts here. So when you look at this kind of mural or collage that the children have made, you will see that some of the inserts, some of the pictorial representations are actually cutouts. And this is really, really good way of actually including those younger children, because if you've actually seen a drawing of a 5-year-old that looks a bit like a blob, and you just can't, it's really difficult to analyze. And children really like this. And it's something that every child can participate in, and inclusivity in this is one of our key things. After doing this, and the children worked on this, they were aged from 5 to 9.5 of the children that worked on this particular collage. They all agreed that this collage represented their breakfast club. And the key things that mattered to them, after all, the breakfast club actually is for the children attending as well as the parents. And then following that, we actually worked with our artists in residence, so at the school, who came up with this wonderful illustration. And all of the children looked at this and agreed that this actually represented their views. And we made a few amendments before we actually finalized this. The most important amendment was having Larry the cat right at the top at the door of number 10. And children were insistent that Larry actually be notified of their views on Breakfast Club. And this was sent up to Cabinet Office. So children's advice to the Prime Minister on that collage is extensive, but I've summarised some of the key points below. Perhaps the key thing is children want their voices to be heard, and they want it to be heard in a meaningful way in terms of co-designing not just the practice, but also the policy. So the policy around Breakfast Club. They want school breakfast clubs to be inclusive, socially just and fair. They think that no child should miss out on the opportunity to eat breakfast. They would like practically a range of hot and cold food to be provided. And we know that actually experiential learning activity improves children's dietary intake, health, knowledge, and self-confidence. So actually thinking about how they self-serve, how they actually have some ownership and autonomy rather than just being served the breakfast, how they can actually lay the table. These are really important skills and children like doing it. Our school club, all school clubs should have someone like our teaching assistant. Miss Edwards was absolutely brilliant. Children made this point over and over again. We've just replicated this same methodology in 4 other schools. This is what comes out time and time again. That friendship, that relationship with the teaching assistants and the staff is a key factor in terms of sustained attendance at the Breakfast Club, children arriving punctual in a punctual nature, and pupils' behaviour at the Breakfast Club. So key assets are the people actually supporting the Breakfast Club. And children want to have far greater inputs into decision about their school breakfast clubs, hence the poster to the Prime Minister. Children thought age-related differences and differences in individual preferences, needs and abilities should be accommodated wherever possible. So, for example, a quiet corner of the school dining hall for children who want to read and study, or just for those children that find noisy environments difficult. And all of that came from 5 to 9-year-olds. So I thought that was brilliant. In addition to looking at the child's voice and key stakeholders' voice, we also wanted to speak in a really kind of intense way to parents and to staff organising the school breakfast club. And this is actually a picture of Miss Edwards from West Denton Primary School up in Newcastle upon Tyne. She's given me permission to share this photo, and you can see we actually carried out a lengthy one-to-one interview with Miss Denton, as well as other members of staff and the parents themselves. And this is how we framed this creative brief. So looking at here, we had like facilitators as well, but looking at some of the difficulties and obstacles. And one of the things that came up across all of the 4 schools that we have looked at is the space. So Department for Education have done their modelling in terms of funding. And whilst it's not a target, they've based a lot of the figures that they're circulating on a 50% uptake. And if you look on the left-hand side here, just under difficulties and obstacles, at the moment, this school has 45 to 50 children in the hall for Breakfast Club. 50% of the school population is 160. And I think Miss Edwards, who wrote this, said 160 kids, we're in trouble. They cannot accommodate 50% of pupils in that particular space. So they would have to switch their current model that they really want to hold on to into actually a classroom-based model. If they then have pupils in the classroom, the issue then becomes a staffing model, because obviously you have to have staff to supervise those pupils in an individual classroom. And therefore, the additionality in terms of the funding, which I think is quite generous by the Department for Education, actually takes a real hit, because you're having to multiply if you can actually source those staff to cover the breakfast club period. So that gives you an indication of some of the practical issues that are faced at school, as well as many others. And from the parent and staff insights, we actually came up with this illustration that was then shared with all parents and staff and met their approval. And I think what you can see on the top here, and this is in almost like a rank order. Right at the top, you can see reduces child anxiety, knowing that they won't be late for school, trust, play and interaction with other children, friends, and trusted adults. It comes up time and time and time again. So seeing this positive interaction for pupils, giving them tasks, making them feel part of the school community is a key thing that always comes up. And this came up in all of the 4 schools, and they were very different schools with different populations, different locations in terms of indices of multiple child deprivation. This model holds pretty true. So these, I think, are important considerations, not only for the Department for Education, but also for local authorities, academies, and schools themselves. And so from this, we took some of the key issues with implementation and delivery, and I've just put them here on the PowerPoint out of that main illustration just to showcase some of them for you. So one of the things that's already come up with a number of schools is that it's been announced in the press, but my school was having to say our club was not for free because they're not part of the pilot. So this has already caused a little bit of issues with some parents. Other staff are saying, we are the people who actually work in the schools delivering breakfast clubs. We know the sort of things that they, i.e. the government, didn't think about. So, for example, thinking of that capacity issue in the school hall for 150 children, that's 50% of the school population. And we feel almost forced into implementing the scheme because the government's now said that the scheme is going to be implemented. Wider benefits to participate in school. It doesn't make anyone feel different. So the universalism of the scheme was really heralded as a great success. It wasn't targeted on just disadvantaged children or those that are hungry. It was actually something that everyone thought was a really positive ethos in terms of the school. It's helped getting children into school. They want to be in now because they know that they are going to get their breakfast and play, that social interaction again, before school. And it helps parents get to work. And I've put on there, we've known for years that many parents use breakfast clubs for childcare, but this was not talked about in the past. So I'm really glad that the government is now saying this is an important part of what breakfast clubs can be for. And we're making it clear to children it's not just about hungry children, and so it's the same to parents. It does definitely alleviate hunger in the morning. It actually helps so that soft start to the day. We know that hungry children become more agitated, and at least in terms of their cognition, we're not putting them in a prime state to learn. And then there's the financial benefits for parents and families. Parents that would otherwise struggle, hopefully it'll make things a little bit easier for them. The Department for Education, I think that they estimate about a £450 per annum saving for parents. The revised criteria for free school meals and a breakfast for every child will result in huge savings for families. But note of importance here, because now we will have many more children both actually receiving a school breakfast and a free school meal, given the government's change in the eligibility criteria for free school meals, which is absolutely excellent. It's also important to note that school food standards and the new revised school food standards must be adhered to, because many children will be getting about 60% of their dietary intake from schools during the term time. And it alleviates the rush routine for families. So thinking about not just for those really in need, but also professional parents that have to get to work in time. and thinking about how that school breakfast club can work as a period of social dining where pupils are sitting down together to have their breakfast, which isn't always available at home. So I come back and I end on this again. So this was the process evaluation, our model that we came up with 10 years ago. And I think it's a pretty good fit today. So hopefully you've enjoyed my talk, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Greta. What a wealth of knowledge and some excellent examples of work that you've done. I particularly love the illustrations for the theory of change that just makes it much more comprehensible to a wide audience, which is what we need for this particular policy. I also really love the data collection method. I mean, that was just remarkable, using the hands so it's really accessible for all types of children, which is so important because often that isn't possible to capture the same level of data from all children, because some have extra verbal skills or don't feel shy. And so yeah, what a wonderful way of using that. I'd love to start with a question which is sort of related to that data collection before I move into to the others, about whether or not you feel that would be part of the rollout. So every school had a way of really engaging children to understand children's perspectives, because children engagement is so important. Obviously parental engagement as well, which is more challenging for schools, you hear. Just your thoughts on that would be really welcome.
Yeah, so I think we have a shift in how we view the rights and voices of children and young people in services that are for them. And I think that true co-designing, and when I talk about co-designing, it's slightly different to co-production. So co-designing to me is when you're actually involving children or parents or young people in creating almost like a product or program. And when you're looking at this type of approach, I think it's really important that we didn't go in with research questions. Yeah, because if I'm co-designing them, I have to co-design the question as well. And in a wider sense, this is quite problematic in a way for funders, because we all know as academics, when we write funding bids, we put in our research questions, our hypothesis, we put in our methodology, our data analysis, etc. What I think the shift will be is that we really need to co-design not just participant information forms and the language, that's a really superficial level, but actually saying what's really important both theoretically and actually important for children. So when I look at that and I look at the hands in particular, that reinforces my theoretical perspective that children value breakfast clubs for that friendship element. So when you're then taking this kind of methodology into schools, it's a really easy method for school teachers, breakfast club supervisors to simply do a creative hands, jazz hands as I call them, and look at that and say, actually, here we've got 5 children that don't like the juices. You don't need me to go and do it, right? They can do it right there at the school. It's a really engaging activity for children, and it also allows children themselves. So what the school we're working with in the Northeast is saying, we can actually allow children to say, actually, you said we did. So for example, with the juice, right? And most of the children didn't like the juice. They changed the juice, and then they did the same thing again. And the juice switched hands, and they showed the children that the juice had switched hands. And actually that was a really positive thing. And they've done it with some of their cereals and toast and the same things. So for example, we've got children now eating wholemeal toast because it switched hands. Does that make sense?
And what a lovely way to engage children in, policy change. So I guess,
Right.
do you feel that it would be feasible for a vast majority of schools to use that methodology for implementation of this scheme? There are so many logistical challenges that schools are facing. Certainly I'm a governor, a school governor, and our school doesn't have a kitchen. So it is a challenge, for the school to even try to implement this.
Yeah, so I think that children and teachers and parents have probably come up with the most innovative solutions.
Yeah.
Because they're there, they understand their school, they understand the needs of the parents, the needs of the children, they understand how it fits within their wider school culture and context. And I think that what I would advise schools is when they're looking at this, include your school caterer, right? The school caterer, whether the food is brought in, is already providing food for your school.
Mm-hmm.
Why not think about the social value as part of that catering contract? Can they provide the food for the breakfast as well? Because the logistics of getting the food for the breakfast will either mean that it has to be delivered separately, or some teaching assistant or volunteer or parent volunteer is going to have to go to the shops and buy it. Now, the problem with that is that then that knowledge base around, for example, school food standards, allergies, has to then be, people have to be upskilled in doing that. But actually your school caterer, whether that's a local authority or a private catering provider in England, already has that knowledge set. So capitalize on that knowledge and use some of those resources.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how much cost is a barrier to that. Is it cheaper to self-source and to go to the supermarket to buy that rather than to rely on the caterer? And I have no idea, but whether that would be a driving force for many schools.
Well, my view is, let's be kind of like forceful in it, and saying to the caterers, as part of your social value, we would like you to offer breakfast cereal and bread.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to go to some of the questions they're streaming in. So Hannah Janik says, how are breakfast clubs organised in the UK? Is there a supervisor? Are pupils encouraged to help with preparation of meals, etc.? Do you know how is it structured generally?
Okay, there's multiple models, so there's lots of flexibility, and I will say that currently the evidence, we don't have enough evidence to say that one model is better than another model. So I think really what happens here is the model fits the school, is what I'm saying. So often in the UK, there'll be like someone like Miss Edwards, for example. She's a teaching assistant in the wider school. That link to the wider school actually is quite important, because it makes the breakfast club part of the school day rather than a bolt-on or an add-on. And what happens normally in breakfast clubs, whether they're in a classroom or in a dining room, is that there is a supervisor, in this case Miss Edwards, who's also a teaching assistant, that obviously for health and safety checks the students in, makes sure that students eating, controls the behaviour, and actually helps in that kind of like soft start into the school classroom. One of the issues that potentially I can see happening, as breakfast clubs increase in capacity, that pinch point in arriving at the school day, and everybody that's had children knows what that's like. There's loads of children flooding into school. We have to think really carefully how if that gets transferred into a breakfast club setting. Because with one midday or one teaching assistant supervising and one midday assistant, having 150 children arrive at that breakfast club entrance between a very short time period will be problematic.
Mm.
So that's how it normally works in the UK. Children getting different measures, different ways of looking at it. Some children self-serve, others don't. Others actually get the breakfast given to them, but most children have a degree of choice. All of the food that is served should comply to school food standards, which is basically our dietary guidelines for schools in England.
Great. So that links to the next question from Chris Young. Food served at breakfast clubs must meet requirements of the School Food Regulations 2014. These regulations do not require bread to have a minimum fibre content set at a maximum salt content, or require bread to be non-UPF, additive free, etc.
Yeah.
Do you agree with the Real Bread campaign that these standards need improving to ensure taxpayers' money is spent on healthier, less processed bread for children to enjoy at breakfast clubs or as part of their school lunches?
Yes.
So
So
how do we achieve that? Is that likely to happen?
I think it is likely to happen. So I think when I look at ultra processed food, I think we have to be very careful that we don't lump everything together. So some minimal processed food I think will be okay, and I think there's some good reasons to do that around food safety. But there are so many things that we can give our children for breakfast that basically are not processed at all. So we have fruit. We can think about schools have the opportunity to work with what I call short supply chains. So thinking, do you have a local baker that could actually produce bread and you could give the children fresh bread, right? Why not? It's there. We can actually reduce our carbon footprint by doing that. And we can actually then have that relationship with that baker go out into parents, into the wider foodscape outside of school. So I think that school breakfast clubs and school meals in general are a missed opportunity at the moment, because what we do is we have nutritional education in schools that's teaching our children to have certain foods, eat in certain ways, and most of it is very good. But it doesn't correspond to what they even then see at breakfast club or lunch. It's absolutely mind-blowing to me. When we're looking at children, when they're learning about foods to eat, we have to then reinforce that in just this, it sounds soft, but it's quite a hard reinforcement, and that they're eating the same things. So if you have, and this is thinking about schools, like linking everything up. So thinking about if you're having a lesson on, for example, protein or fiber, make sure that that is signposted both at breakfast clubs and at lunch. So you were listening about, for example, being taught about beans, but here are beans in your lunch. This is what you're eating. Those missing links, we have this siloed approach to everything in our schools. And I think that we should take that away and say our approach should just be child-centered. It's the child that we're educating. That's it.
Yeah, so I completely agree with that. And I'm going to link to a question from an anonymous attendee, but I squeeze in one of my own first. I noticed that siloed policy making, and look, it's so evident. Policies have across the health department, across the Department for Education, they are made individually, which means that they don't necessarily link up. It makes it confusing for consumers. It makes it harder for settings to implement. What do we do about that? How do we start to really, is it our role with our recommendations to see those linkages and offer them back as potential policy recommendations, or are there other ways that we can really facilitate more joined up policy making?
I think they can do it both. So I think it's important to point out that rather than have this siloed approach, because it's handy for government to say, actually, almost devolution empowers us to do this, right? So as funded, to me, funding should go to schools, and schools can actually, they're the best people and best places to decide how that funding is spent, all right? When I look at whole school approaches, whilst I agree with them, I think there's problems even with that. So we have whole school approach to food, whole school approach to physical activity. It's the same children. We just need to have a child approach, a child-centered approach. That's all we need. And what we then do is we think about, if, for example, let me give you the example of breakfast, right? Nobody in their right mind with their child at home would give their child a breakfast and say, right, now we're going to go and do skipping and jump rope for 10 minutes, because you'd probably think the child's going to be sick, right? So rather than but that's food and physical activity in a breakfast club. If you just start to say, put the child at the center of everything and co-design that interaction of how all of these different programs, which cumulatively together will have a huge impact, but they're not at the moment because they're fragmented and they don't niche together. So I think, to me, we just put children at the center of everything and say, what is our aim of education? Well, we want to have well-educated, healthy, both physically and mental and in terms of mental health, children. And if we do that, everything will come out. But I think running this type of co-design with different partners feeding in at different levels is the real way of starting to show to government, this is the power that you've already got. It's not requiring additional investment. It's there. It's just bringing it all together.
Yeah, and linking it with curriculum. I mean, that's one of the tensions. So the anonymous attendee said, thanks so much, Greta. With breakfast clubs forthcoming, how can we feed in this amazing insight to make sure breakfast clubs reflect them? And I guess the question is, many schools are focused on curricula. They're focused on what Ofsted are judging them on, and that's right. food, physical activity, mental health are often seen as adults because they're not necessarily measured in that Ofsted. Should there be something that we're calling for around breakfast clubs, school food, wraparound care that is more holistic, that takes that sort of child-centered approach?
Absolutely. Because if you have a well-fed, well-exercised child, I can guarantee that child will have better attention to what you're teaching them in class. But then thinking about it as, again, a child-centered approach, right? So we know the effects of breakfast on cognition, how long it lasts. So looking at the blood-brain barrier, thinking about when children are at their peak in terms of their cognitive processing, especially sustained attention and memory. So designing the curriculum to teach the core subjects when children are at their peak, rather than when they're at their lowest in terms of their cognitive processing, is easy. We've known the evidence for years and years. It's just we have our set ways of doing things in our silos that can't budge. So it's not to distract, it's to add on the value of the school. Because, by the way, you're doing breakfast clubs and you're feeding the children at lunchtime anyway. So why not add that added value that you can get in terms of making sure that those children are then ready to learn, whether it be across the morning, whether it be in the afternoon, or whether it just be in general school attendance. We have to create an environment where parents and children want to go to school.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Rachel Connett says, how are schools managing with accessing the quantity of affordable food that they need for breakfast clubs?
So at the moment, the 750 on the pilot seem to be doing fine. I will say the uptake is nowhere near the 50% that the government is looking for in terms of their calculations. So most schools have an uptake of about 20 to 30%. That's held true over the last few years. So I think that actually the pilot schools, I don't think we've actually seen the squeeze on the food at the moment, because I think pilot schools, remember, about 80% of primary schools were already running some kind of breakfast provision, which suggests to me that those schools have already identified a need. I think that's important to say. So I am pleased that the government is actually responding to that and funding it. I don't think the squeeze on the food has come yet. I think the squeeze in terms of sourcing the food will come when the program gets rolled out and it becomes a more normative behavior and those numbers start to creep up. And I think that's the time to really start to have eyes on how that will actually work in terms of its implementation.
What might we be able to do as sort of practitioners and researchers and, policymakers to support that, so it doesn't, cause a whole lot of barriers or challenges for schools and make them, it sort of put the policy at risk to some extent?
Yeah, I think the way to do it is to do kind of like the work we're doing currently at all different levels. So making this available to schools. So I'm sharing this freely with everybody. Take the methods, use them. It's free for schools. Everybody can use them. Thinking at that national policy level, thinking at the local authority or the academy trust level, thinking at the school level, saying, actually, how can I do to identify some of these things that have come up early in terms of this implementation, and thinking at that level of how do I safeguard my school against that? So how do I think about right now, maybe I'm not one of the 750 schools in the pilot, but this is coming. How do I have those conversations with school caterers? How do I have those conversations with local food suppliers now to be prepared for when it actually implements fully?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jonathan Lodge has a more nutritional question, and I might follow up with one, although actually I can see Louise Nelson has the same idea as I did. So Jonathan Lodge says, it's well known that fruit juice creates a blood sugar spike. Why are we not returning to free milk at school? And is juice competing with milk in sort of this breakfast club situation?
So in the breakfast club, I'm not a nutritional scientist, by the way, so I'm a psychologist. So let me just say that, right? So if I say the wrong thing, I'm not a nutritional scientist, so I defer to probably your expertise on this. They did have milk, and the children normally had lashings of milk with their cereal. I have to say, those bowls were pretty full when I was watching them. I think that the breakfast club at the moment is serving water juice, because it's part of the school food standards. It is included in there. So I think that when you're we have to make, right, we have to make the school standards, food standards, easy for people delivering on the ground, right? Because they are confusing, right? When you look at school food standards. I mean, my goodness, I speak to my nutritional scientists to work it out, right? Because I'm not a nutritionalist. So I think that when we're looking at how something like breakfast clubs are added onto, as well as new implementation, because many schools are already doing it, is to think about, do we have really clear standards? And actually, are those standards monitored? Because at the moment, as we know, it's school governors, right? And, you know, I sit as a school governor like yourself, Christina, and I'm not a nutritional scientist, but I probably know as much, if not more, than most people sitting on there, because it's not the skill set of a particular governor. So I think that when we make our school environment, especially around food, as easy to follow and as simple as possible, that the correct choice, if you like, is the easy choice, I think then we're really starting to crack it. And I will say, and Miss Edwards won't mind me saying, when I went to the school at West Denton, which was it's still a fantastic breakfast club, they were serving chocolate coated cereal. And Miss Edwards is one of the most caring teaching assistants I've ever come across. And she just didn't realize.
Didn't make the link. And so many schools do this. And, you know, some of our own research has shown that actually parents and teachers, they want to avoid that conflict. And so the conflict around food is challenging. So if we just provide it, which again comes to the point about a joined up approach where the advertising is restricted, you know, we have this label of HFSS foods that are not available in schools or nurseries, you know, they're not allowed to be advertised. And yes, we need to refine that definition as new evidence comes around processing or artificial sweeteners. But really, it is important that we have that joined up approach, because I think you're right. Some of it is not about wanting to avoid conflict, but some of it is just not joining the dots too, because
Correct.
it's become so common.
Yeah. And what was really interesting, I just say in that school, if you notice in a lot of the photos, the school cook was there at the breakfast club. The school cook, that's school food standards, right?
Yeah, I think it is. It would be lovely to join them up. And I've heard Henry Dimble be called, you know, for a monitoring of school food standards and school food provision as part of Ofsted visits, that it could and should really be incorporated. So
Right.
Louise Nelson has a question around, and this was related to mine as well, about surprised to hear that Greggs provides funding for school breakfasts. For school breakfast clubs. And do you think that schools will become more reliant on funding from industry if budgets are squeezed and implementation does increase and numbers increase and it makes it harder for schools? Do you think then that there should be some regulations on which companies can fund school breakfast clubs, or whether we should be inviting commercial funding?
Yeah. So, well, if you look at commercial determinants of health, I would probably say no. However, I am going to give you, I think, a reasoned and balanced argument here. The government had funded a national breakfast club program in the past. This is a new national breakfast program, which is more extensive, right? Schools were relying on that funding from Greggs and Kellogg's. Kellogg's give, I think, £1 million a year to schools for breakfast. It's actually just a cash donation. It's not products going in. I think with Greggs, I think their wholemeal bread went in. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that, but they did provide funding. The reality of it is that schools were actually asking for that because there wasn't that resource from government. Schools don't, write applications for grants to foundations just for the fun of it. So they were doing it because those applications weren't from government. The money that's now coming from government, if a school gets to around an average school, so I will say average because the funding algorithm differs a little bit, it's about £23,000 a year. That far outweighs any funding from industry. So I actually think the opposite will happen. I think as the program gets rolled out by government with this funding, I think schools will be able to save time and energy and not have to seek that funding from food manufacturers.
Yeah, and let's hope that that is the case. I mean, the other option could be sort of leaning from the House of Lords report with the announcement over the weekend of mandatory reporting coming in. Could that be used, you know, where the House of Lords was saying that actually companies that achieve targets, so declare and then achieve their targets, are then allowed to have, make these relationships with schools, or, be involved some way in policy making. So there's an incentive there to for further improvement in the nutritional quality of their food portfolio.
I think it's a bit of both, right? So I live in a real world. We all live in a real world, right? I mean, where I live in a deprived part of the Northeast. I have a Greggs, it's, I don't want to be anti a company that has actually, regardless of what food it serves in its shops, which I think is more at the unhealthy end of the market. I think we could all probably agree on that. For a company that's actually put money into breakfast clubs, and many of those breakfast clubs would not have been running in the past, that have helped many children. I am not going to decry that. I think there's an opportunity to work with commercial businesses, but I think it has to be done in the right way. So, for example, and I'll say it here, so hopefully they'll be held to it. If I look at Chartwell's, which is a big company in terms of school food catering, they have a really good program around Natasha's Law and allergies. So why are we reinventing the wheel with charities reinventing what is already really good? I've looked at it very closely. It's a very, very succinct and easy to follow allergy guidance. Why don't we just say to Chartwells, you know what, make that available to all schools just free?
Mm-hmm.
It's not putting branding into the breakfast club. It's going to the staff that are probably aware of Chartwells as a school food provider anyway, right? It's so I think there's ways that we can do it without necessarily putting the food in. And one of the things I would say about Kellogg's with their grant, just like Greggs, they weren't putting their products or name branding into these breakfast clubs. It was a cash donation. When you look at Kellogg's, you don't see Kellogg, this is a Kellogg's breakfast club at a school. That's not seen. So I think there are sensitive ways of doing it. I think we just have to be careful that breakfast clubs don't become the kind of like food that's served elsewhere. We'll put it into breakfast clubs. And for all that we talk about monitoring school food standards, right? If they were monitored at the current school food standards, I would not see some of the food that I'm seeing in schools. So monitoring's okay, but in reality, we don't have the capacity or the staff to do it. So we have to think far more at the preventative aid at the end of the kind of equation of actually that food just doesn't go into schools and then it's solved.
Yeah, and I mean, making breakfast ideally will be high fiber and highly nutritious and full of fruit and possibly vegetables. That would be the ideal. We know that with, the population level intake of fruit and vegetables dropping by an entire portion since 2019, we've got a lot to do there to really support boosting fruit and veg. And this is a potential opportunity.
But could I just say that, but by co-designing that and informing the children and them being part of co-designing the solution, you don't have to then worry about, right, we want this to happen. How are we going to get that behavior change in children? Because the children are owning those illustrations that the children did. They have them in their breakfast club. They own that. They did it. It's theirs, right? And we know from psychological ownership, if you own something, you care more about it and more likely to do it. So the way to do this is actually co-design that food element with the children up front, because you can have the illustration there saying, you guys asked for this, look, you designed this, right? And they just do it. They don't, we get around so many issues that then become a problem when it's designed up here by adults and we try and force it onto the children, because I see that I used to see that in my own home. Every parent's experienced that, right? So
absolutely.
So do the co-design work early doors is what I'd say.
Yeah, and wonderful. The very last question, Greta, I'm sorry we haven't been able to get through them all, but Lopa Saxena says, does the child-centered approach risk undermining the focus on improving a school-wide food culture and environment?
No, because the child-focused approach, the service is for children, education is for children. So what you do when we're looking at this, we took this approach when we were designing holiday activities and food programs for teenagers. we've taken the same approach when looking at physical activity. Children see themselves as a whole being. They don't see themselves as broken down into the silos of programs, funnily enough. So when you're involving children in it, you make that kind of scope of the design brief as wide and as deep as you want it to make. So we've done work in the Northeast with teenagers of co-designing the whole day, the whole school day, everything from toilets being open to time of arrival, to where break time is, to what's for lunch, to the physical activity, the playroom. And when you look at that, that's how children experience a day at school. It's a school day. I'm going to school for the day. So by involving the staff, children or young people often become aware of the tension. So let me give you a really quick example. I went into a school and it was National Hydration Week. And because of behavioural issues in the school, the top 2 tiers of toilets were closed. Just think about that.
Mm.
And the head teacher closed the toilets because of the behaviours. I understand that. But hadn't linked to actually it was hydration week and the children were being told to drink lots of water, and the girls in particular weren't drinking the water, not because they didn't want to drink the water, but they couldn't get down 3 flights of stairs quick enough. So something very simple had an absolutely game-changing impact on that school of how they work together, and they negotiate from that pupil behaviour charter.
What a wonderful example to end on. Thank you so much, Greta. You're a wealth of information and knowledge and skills. And as we say, hopefully this methodology can be used as part of that formal rollout. Thank you again so much. This recording will be made available, so do feel free to share it. And Greta has said that she'll share her slides as well, so we can make them available to the mailing list afterwards. Lots of thank yous coming in now, Greta. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you again in September, so enjoy a well-earned break over the summer. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.